My mornings on the 42nd floor always began with silence. At 6:30 a.m., the automated curtains glided open with a mechanical whisper, admitting a cold, clinical light that had not yet been softened by the city's smog. I would open my eyes and stare at the ceiling, a white, sterile expanse, and listen to the rhythmic breathing of my husband, Mark, beside me. 10 years. 3,665 such mornings. If I had to describe our marriage in a single word, I would have chosen geometry. Everything was measured, symmetrical, and structurally sound. Our lives converged at a perfect perspective point. Shared investments, shared social circles, and shared silences that felt like peace, but were actually just absences. I rose quietly, the silk of my robe cool against my skin, and walked into the kitchen. The espresso machine was already warmed up, filling the air with the scent of expensive Arabica. This was the smell of our success. I cherished this solitude, the 20 minutes before the world started, when I could be Elena the analyst, rather than Elena the wife of the city's most celebrated architect. Mark joined me 15 minutes later. He was already showered, his face smooth, smelling of the sandalwood cologne I had gifted him for our last anniversary. "Good morning," he said, pressing a dry kiss to the top of my head. It was a habitual gesture, as automatic as checking the stock market. "Breakfast is in the fridge," I replied, my eyes fixed on my tablet. "Do you have the city developers meeting today?" "Yes," he said, pouring coffee. "Then lunch with the partners. I'll be late tonight. The revisions for the shopping center are due by dawn." I finally looked at him. He was squinting at the sunrise, adjusting the heavy watch on his left wrist, a telltale sign that he was either anxious or in a hurry. "Again?" I asked softly. "That's the third late night this week, Mark. You're overworking yourself." "We're building an empire, Elle," he smiled. It was that smile, the one that had disarmed me a decade ago in a dusty university library. But for the first time, I felt a strange, cold static in the air. As he turned to grab his briefcase, I noticed a tiny, microscopic detail on the shoulder of his charcoal coat, a single blue thread. I didn't own anything in that shade of cobalt. "Nonsense," I whispered to myself as the door clicked shut. "It's just a thread." In the office, I was a god of data. I managed millions of dollars, navigating the chaotic tides of the market with a cold, detached logic. But that afternoon, the logic felt like a cage. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the hum of the air conditioning sounding like a low-frequency scream. I stared at a spreadsheet until the cells blurred into a gray haze. My mind kept looping back to that blue thread. It wasn't just a thread, it was a breach in my security system. I felt a hollow sensation in my chest, a physical emptiness where my heartbeat used to be. My husband had always been transparent, or so I had convinced myself. But as I sat there, I realized I had been willfully blind. I had ignored the subtle shifts in the air, the way he would suddenly go quiet when I entered the room, the way his laughter had become a rehearsed soundtrack. I didn't do what emotional wives do. I didn't cry. Crying was for those who still had hope. Instead, I opened our joint credit card portal. My fingers were cold as I typed the password. I began to audit our life. I felt a strange clinical detachment, a numbing anesthesia that allowed me to look at my own betrayal as if it were someone else's bankruptcy. Every transaction was a heartbeat of a lie, a charge at a boutique florist in the East End, a part of town Mark hated, a recurring charge for a subscription service called Cloud Vault I didn't recognize. The silence of the data was deafening. I wasn't heartbroken yet. I was merely solving a puzzle. But inside, I could feel the first cracks of a landslide. 3 days later, the report from Elias arrived. I sat in my parked car, the rain drumming against the roof like 1,000 accusatory fingers. When I opened the first file, the world seemed to tilt. It was a photo. Mark was sitting in a sun-drenched trafe, the kind of place with exposed brick and hanging plants that he used to mock. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at her. She was younger, her dark hair tied in a loose bun that suggested a casual intimacy I hadn't seen in years. She wore a cobalt blue sweater, the exact shade of the thread. Seeing her didn't feel like a stab. It felt like a slow-acting poison. I watched a video clip Elias had attached. Mark reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. My stomach twisted. That was my gesture. That was the way he used to look at me before we became geometry. I felt a wave of cold fury, followed by a crushing sense of inadequacy that I immediately suppressed. I realized then that my perfect life was a theatrical production, and I was the only person in the audience who didn't know the script. I drove home in a trance, the city lights blurring into long, jagged lines of neon. When I walked through our door, Mark was there, swirling a glass of red wine. He looked so comfortable in his lie. "Hard day?" he asked. His voice was warm, a perfect imitation of love. "Just a lot of data to process," I replied. My voice was a flat line. I looked at him and saw a stranger wearing my husband's skin. The betrayal wasn't just the woman, it was the fact that he could look me in the eye and pretend the world hadn't ended. The following week was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Every time Mark touched my shoulder, I felt a jolt of electricity, not the good kind, but the kind that warns you of a short circuit. I lived with a ghost. I watched him eat, sleep, and breathe, all while knowing his heart was miles away in a cobalt blue sweater. I spent my lunch hours in the back of Ubers, a silent observer in my own tragedy. I learned her name, Sarah, a junior designer, younger, vibrant, and, this was the part that hurt the most, utterly oblivious to me. To her, I was just a name on a legal document he was working on leaving. One Tuesday, I stood across the street from a park and watched them. Mark was laughing. It was a bright, unfiltered sound that shattered my composure. I took out my phone and recorded it. I needed to hear it. I needed to remind myself that his tiredness at home was a choice. That night, I locked myself in my office. I wasn't crying anymore. I was calculating. I looked at the deed to our penthouse. I looked at the offshore accounts he thought were invisible. If he wanted to build a new life, I would make sure he had to build it in the ruins of his old one. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but it was being wrapped in a layer of cold, hard steel. The confrontation didn't happen in a bedroom. I wanted an audience. I wanted the setting to match the scale of the treason. I chose his firm's 10th anniversary gala. I wore a dress the color of midnight, silk that felt like armor. I looked impeccable, the perfect trophy wife, standing by his side as he accepted the city's praise. My heart was thundering against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, but my face was a mask of marble. When the toasts ended, I led him to his private office. The glass walls overlooked the city he thought he had conquered. "We need to talk," I said. "Elle, not now. People are waiting." He dismissed me with a wave. "The people can wait. Your secrets can't." I laid the folder on his mahogany desk. I watched his face as he opened it. It was like watching a building undergo a controlled demolition. The confusion, the recognition, the terror. "I've spent 10 years analyzing data, Mark," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't need your excuses. I have the receipts. You didn't just break a vow, you embezzled our future." The look he gave me wasn't one of regret, it was the look of a trapped animal, and in that moment, any lingering love I had for him evaporated. He wasn't the great architect, he was a small man who had made a very large mistake. The months that followed weren't a storm, they were a glacier, slow, crushing, and irreversible. The geometry of my life didn't just break, it was methodically dismantled, piece by piece, by a woman who treated divorce like a military siege. My lawyer, Claire, was a shark in a pinstripe suit. Her office was a fortress of mahogany and silence, perched high above the city, smelling of expensive cedar and the metallic tang of old money. "Elena," she told me during our first strategy session, "we aren't just asking for a settlement, we are conducting a forensic autopsy. He stole the oxygen from your marriage. We are going to take the marrow from his bones." We didn't just go for the bank accounts, we went for the jugular. I spent my nights submerged in spreadsheets, my eyes burning from the blue light of the monitor. I became a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of Mark's unraveling. Every hidden transaction we uncovered, every shell company with names like Apex Design Holdings or Blue Harbor Consulting, was a blow to the myth he had built. I watched his professional empire begin to bleed out in real time. It started with whispers in the architectural circles, then escalated to formal inquiries. The board members, men who had once toasted his visionary genius, now looked at him with the cold suspicion of investors who realized they'd been sold a beautiful facade with a crumbling foundation. I realized then, they weren't just losing an architect, they were realizing he couldn't even manage the basic structural integrity of his own integrity. Living in the penthouse during the litigation felt like being a refugee in a museum of my own mistakes. Every evening, Mark would return home, and the air between us would turn to lead. We stopped speaking. We communicated through a series of increasingly hostile, legal notes of discovery. I spent my nights in my half-packed apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes that looked like miniature monoliths of my failed life. The kitchen, half empty, the smells of Arabica replaced by the sterile scent of packing tape. The bedroom, a battlefield where the lines had been drawn down the center of the bed. The hallway, echoing with a hollow sound that mocked the 10 years of laughter we had shared there. I felt a strange, heavy sense of mourning. It wasn't for him. The man I now saw was a collection of shallow insecurities and expensive colognes. It was for the life I thought I had. I was grieving a ghost. I was mourning a version of myself that was naive enough to believe that forever was a mathematical certainty. But in that chaos, amidst the boxes and the legal threats, I found a spark of something I hadn't felt since my early 20s, autonomy. Every document I signed, every offshore account I froze, was a brick I was laying for my own fortress. I wasn't just Elena the analyst, I was Elena the survivor. I realized that my value wasn't tied to being the architect's wife. My value was the very thing that was currently destroying him, my mind. I moved out on a Tuesday. I chose Tuesday because it was a mundane, unremarkable day, a working day. I didn't want the drama of a weekend or the sentimentality of a Friday. I didn't take the mid-century modern furniture we'd picked out in Milan. I didn't take the art that cost more than a small house. I left it all behind, like skin a snake no longer needs. I took my dignity. I took my laptop, the weapon that had won the war. I took a small suitcase of clothes. Before I closed the door for the final time, I walked into the kitchen. The marble counter was cold. I took a small white envelope from my pocket. Inside was the single cobalt blue thread, the tiny spark that had burned his world down. I placed it next to my set of keys. It was a final souvenir of the lie, a reminder that even the grandest structures can be brought down by a single misplaced fiber. As the elevator descended to the ground floor, I felt the weight of the 42nd story lift from my chest. I walked out into the Tuesday afternoon traffic, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't looking for a perspective point. I was just looking forward. I am standing in my new loft now, and for the first time in a decade, the air I breathe feels entirely my own. This space is the antithesis of the 42nd floor penthouse. There, everything was glass and steel, transparent but cold, a cage designed to reflect Mark's ego. Here, the walls are exposed red brick, scarred and uneven, showing the history of the building. The floors are worn oak, dark and creaky in places, echoing with the honest sound of my footsteps. It's imperfect, raw, and slightly chaotic, and I love every unpolished inch of it. There are no automated curtains here. I pull the heavy linen drapes by hand, feeling the texture of the fabric against my palms. The city outside is bathed in the cool, bruised tones of dusk. From this lower vantage point, I am closer to the heartbeat of the streets. I can see the movement of people, the headlights of cars, real life, not a distant simulation viewed from a high-altitude pedestal. My new firm, Vantage Analytics, is not just growing, it is thriving on the wreckage of the illusions I helped dismantle. I don't help men like Mark build hollow empires anymore. I am the one they call when they suspect the foundations are rotting. I help my clients see the hidden leaks, the whispered lies in the spreadsheets, and the truth that lurks beneath the polished surface before their own empires come crashing down. There is a profound, almost primal satisfaction in being the bringer of clarity. I am no longer the one being audited, I am the auditor. I walk over to the large, industrial-framed window and look at my reflection in the darkening glass. The woman looking back is a stranger to the Elena of a year ago. I am thinner, my features sharpened by the stress and the subsequent liberation. My eyes are harder, perhaps, but they are also clearer, devoid of the desperate flicker of hope that used to haunt them. There is a peaceful, grounded strength in my posture that wasn't there before. The quiet, vibrating tension that lived in my shoulders for 10 years has finally settled into a steady, low-frequency hum of purpose. I am no longer the silent partner, the variable in the architect's equation, or the trophy displayed at galas. I am the woman who survived the demolition of her own heart and decided to use the rubble to pave a new road. The loft is quiet, but it is not empty. It is filled with my books, my choices, and my silence. There is no scent of sandalwood cologne lingering in the hallways, no sound of a voice rehearsing lies in the next room. There is only the hum of my laptop and the distant siren of a city that never stops moving. I pick up my glass of wine, a deep, complex red that Mark always found too bold, and I raise it to the blank space in front of me, to the empty rooms that I will fill on my own terms, to the projects that bear only my name. The geometry of my life is no longer about the exhausting pursuit of symmetry or the frantic need to make everything look right to the outside world. It's about balance. It's about the weight of truth finally offsetting the weight of the lie. And for the first time in 10 years, as I stand here in the twilight of my new beginning, I feel the scales settle. They are perfectly, beautifully even. A year is a long time in the world of data, but in the world of the heart, it is an eternity. It was a Tuesday, exactly 14 months after the day I had left the keys on the marble counter. I was coming out of a gallery opening in the West End, my own celebration of a successful quarter for Vantage Analytics. The air was thick with the scent of wet pavement and the first hint of autumn. I was reaching into my bag for my car keys when I saw him. Mark was standing by the fountain, hunched against the drizzle. He wasn't the man from the billboards anymore. The charcoal coat I once loved was gone, replaced by something nondescript and slightly worn at the cuffs. His posture, once the very definition of architectural precision, was slumped, as if the structural integrity of his soul had finally given way. "Elena," he said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of the smooth, confident resonance that had once been my favorite sound. I stopped. I didn't feel the surge of panic I had expected. I didn't feel the heat of anger. Instead, I felt a strange, detached curiosity, the way a scientist looks at an ancient artifact from a civilization that no longer exists. "Mark," I replied. My voice was steady, a clear, sharp line in the damp air. "I've been waiting for you." He stepped closer, and for the first time I saw the lines around his eyes. They weren't the lines of a man who had lived well. They were the scars of a man who had lost his way. "Elle, I've had a lot of time to think. In the small apartment, in the silence." He looked down at his shoes, then back at me, his eyes brimming with a desperation that made my skin crawl. "I made a catastrophic mistake. Not just the money, not just Sarah, who was nothing. I threw away the only foundation that ever mattered. I'm sorry. I am so profoundly sorry." I watched him. A year ago, these words would have been the oxygen I needed to breathe. I would have clung to them, wept over them, and perhaps even tried to rebuild. But as I stood there in my midnight blue coat, I realized that the Elena who loved him had died in that courtroom. The woman standing here now was someone he didn't even know. "The thing about foundations, Mark," I said, and my voice was as cold and beautiful as a diamond, "is that once they are cracked to the core, you don't repair them, you demolish them, and you build something new on a different plot of land." "Can't we just talk, for old time's sake?" He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as if to touch my arm. I stepped back, not out of fear, but out of a need for clean air. "There are no old times, Mark. There is only the data, and the data shows that you are a stranger to me. I don't recognize the man who stood in that gallery today, because that man was a fiction I helped you write. I've stopped being your editor." "You've changed," he whispered, a look of genuine shock crossing his face. "You're so cold." I smiled then, a small, genuine smile that didn't reach my eyes. "No, Mark, I'm not cold, I'm just solid. I am a load-bearing structure now, and I don't have any room in my blueprints for a ghost." I walked past him then, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the stone. I didn't need to look back to see him standing there in the rain. I didn't need to. He was a footnote in a chapter I had already finished reading. As I got into my car and pulled away into the neon glow of the city, I realized that the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of me, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. Thanks for watching to the end. I'm sure you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe to the channel. Click on the next video mine on your screen. You'll definitely like it. Bye-bye.